15th, and I'm sitting down with my second cup of coffee, and I wanted to talk about a few things that's in the news this morning. Later today at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, I'll be giving a presentation online regarding the unsettling truth of Abraham Lincoln's legacy. So we'll be talking about President's Day and Abraham Lincoln much more in detail there. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Joe Biden's statement that he released on Saturday regarding the Senate impeachment trial and the acquittal of Donald Trump. But before I begin, let me do as I always do, by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from my home in Washington, D.C., which is a traditional land of the Piscataway. And I want to honor and thank the Piscataway for being the stewards of these lands. They have been here long before Columbus got lost at sea, and they're still here. And so it's with great honor that I acknowledge the Piscataway people, and I humbly state that it is a privilege that I am able to live on these lands today. So my Piscataway relatives, thank you for your stewardship of these lands. So as everybody knows, over the weekend, Donald Trump was acquitted of guilt in the Senate impeachment trial, and he is not being held accountable for his role in inciting they call it an insurrection. It technically was a white nationalist terrorist attack on our nation's capital. And this weekend, the Senate acquitted him. And they actually, even after they won the vote to call witnesses, they decided not to, because it actually said senators want to go home for Valentine's Day. This is how important justice is in our nation. And so and then later in the day, Donald Trump, our President Biden, issued a statement, and I want to share that statement with you. I'm actually going to put this into the chat of the links. I've learned that these things I'm sharing are not going live into the YouTube channel, so I'm going to go back later today and put them into the notes of the meeting. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you may not see the link I just shared, but it should be showing up on Facebook. And this is President Biden's statement on the acquittal of Donald Trump. And I just want to read that for us really quick. It's not a very long statement. It says, "It was nearly 2 weeks ago that Jill and I paid our respects to Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, who laid in honor in the rotunda after losing his life protecting the Capitol from a riotous, violent mob on January 6, 2021. Today, 57 senators, including a record 7 Republicans, voted to find former President Trump guilty for inciting that deadly insurrection on our very democracy. The Senate vote followed the bipartisan vote to impeach him by the House of Representatives. While the final vote did not lead to a conviction, the substance of the charge is not in dispute. Even those opposed to the conviction, like Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, believe Donald Trump was guilty of a disgraceful dereliction of duty and practically and morally responsible for provoking the violence unleashed on the Capitol. Tonight, I am thinking about those who bravely stood guard that January day. I'm thinking about all those who lost their lives, all those whose lives were threatened, and all those who are still today living with terror they lived through that day. And I am thinking of those who demonstrated the courage to protect the integrity of our democracy, Democrats and Republicans, election officials and judges, elected representatives and poll workers before and after the election. This sad chapter in our history has reminded us that democracy is fragile, that it must be defended, that we must be ever vigilant, that violence and extremism has no place in America, and that each of us has a duty and responsibility as Americans, especially as leaders, to defend the truth and defeat the lies. This is how we end this uncivil war and heal the very soul of our nation. That is the task ahead. And it's a task we must undertake together as the United States of America. If you remember, immediately after the voting took place on Saturday, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, who voted to acquit Donald Trump, made a statement. And in his statement, he said that Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. He said he did not vote for acquittal because he felt the Constitution did not allow them to hold a former president accountable for actions he did while he was in office. And so he voted to acquit Donald Trump, and then he got on camera and said he's guilty, though. And I think this is not only is Mitch McConnell a coward with no integrity, right? I mean, he's in the Senate, and the Senate writes and passes laws, and the Senate had actually voted just earlier in this trial that they were going to they voted on, was this constitutional? And the result of the vote was yes, it was. For whatever reason, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell felt that he didn't have to abide by that vote, and he could still do whatever he felt like. He was not able to acknowledge, for whatever reason, that he was part of a body that was larger than himself. And so he voted to acquit, even though he felt, actually, he sounds like he didn't even listen to the arguments. He said had he not felt the way he felt, he would have listened to the arguments to see if he was guilty. But I'm assuming because he didn't think the Constitution gave him the space to do that, he didn't even sound like he listened to the arguments. Again, which is an act of cowardice and not leadership. But then the other challenge I have with this, and over the weekend, right, I've been kind of gauging the response of people online. And I've been listening to what people have been saying, and especially I've been noticing a lot of people of color have been very frustrated with what's happened. And what's interesting is this wasn't your typical clash between white America and BIPOC, right? This wasn't your typical racial clash. Largely, it was a bunch of white people screaming at each other. The white Republicans felt like they had been cheated out of election, and the white Democrats were pretty adamant that their white landowning male president had won, and they were screaming at each other over that. And the white nationalist Republicans were having their free speech protests, and according to them, some bad players took it out of hand, and it was never Trump's intention. But there were not a lot of voices of people of color within this debate throughout the entire time. And had there been, and we all know this, had there been people of color counter-protesting, are adamant about the results of the election, that the police force on the Capitol that day would have been huge, would have been massive, right? And had there been a large outcry of people of color regarding this, our country at every level would have geared up for violence, and arrests would have been made, and it would have been a very, very, very different scene that we saw than what we saw played out on November 6th. The reason the breach was able to happen, the reason these white nationalist terrorists were able to overtake the Capitol, was because our institutions couldn't fathom that terrorists would have the same color skin as they did. Right? They couldn't fathom that. And so they did very little, if anything, to prepare for it. And so largely people of color sat out. This was mostly a white group screaming match. Where people of color get fatigued and angry is seeing what happened, right? Not only did we see the Capitol get breached, but we saw law enforcement helping them out of the Capitol and letting them go after it was over. Correct? We saw some of the people who were in the Capitol being transferred to prison so they could eat organic food, and being given permission by judges to go on vacations. And we saw the man responsible for this not being held accountable. And this is what is so dangerous, or not dangerous, this is frustrating, I think, for people of color, is white Americans, white politicians are willing just to let this go. Even Joe Biden is saying, well, let's close this chapter in our history. Yes, Donald Trump said some things, and yes, we didn't convict him, but you know what? We felt he was guilty. Even those who didn't want to convict him still felt like he did something wrong, and that should be good enough. We're not actually going to hold him accountable. We're just going to express our displeasure, and that's adequate. And this is where I think people of color see this, and it's actually triggering, right? Because we absolutely know, had any of us behaved as Donald Trump behaved or acted as some of these white supremacists, white nationalist terrorists acted, we would be treated vastly differently. We're very, very, very aware of that. And so for Joe Biden, President Biden, to say, well, it's enough that people thought he was guilty, and for Mitch McConnell to say, well, I thought he was somewhat responsible. He was morally and practically. He wasn't constitutionally responsible, and we're not going to hold him as responsible. And they both said, there's now talk of a commission being held, and there's talk of other charges being brought, but we all know that the system isn't going to bring justice that way. We're very aware of that. And so I feel like, and even when you saw, like when they had the debate on even to allow witnesses, and the Democrats were surprised that the impeachment managers asked for witnesses, and I think even more surprised when they won the vote to get them. And so they had to have that they took a break. They had a quorum call so they could sit and talk about it, and they decided they weren't going to call witnesses. And one of the arguments they said for why they weren't going to call witnesses was because senators wanted to go home for the Thanksgiving or the Valentine's Day weekend. And they didn't want this trial to extend beyond what it had, right? This was the shortest impeachment trial in the history of our nation for a president who incited a white nationalist terrorist attack on our own nation's capital. And the Senate didn't want to disrupt travel plans for Valentine's Day. And I think this is where, as people of color, we're just like, what the hell? What the hell? And now Joe Biden, President Biden, is saying, well, we have to move on and heal from move on, heal. There was no accountability. This is the institutionalized white supremacy that is absolutely incapable of holding white landowning men accountable. How can we move on? We never even dealt with it. And this is where the fatigue that you're seeing, that I'm seeing, of our BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. This fatigue is showing because, like, where is that accountability ever going to come from? What are we going to do with this? And I think this is what feels so overwhelmingly frustrating about this, is the nation is literally ready to move on. Joe Biden, right, didn't want his agenda to get disrupted. And so he didn't want to take the time to have a real trial. Even Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi didn't want to take the time to have a real trial. This is what feels so overwhelmingly frustrating. And this is proof, absolute, undeniable proof that we live in a nation where we the people truly means all the people. And this is a demonstration that the challenge is not only that we have institutionalized racism, right, which mistreats people of color, which we see when our black and brown people get lynched and shot in the back and those kind of things. But this is institutionalized white supremacy. Because our Senate, our Constitution, the leaders of our nation who are white are saying, we're not going to hold this man accountable. And it's just enough that we felt he was guilty. And they're calling this sham that took place this past week and a half. Both sides are claiming victory. And it is victory, right? Because for the establishment, for the institution, for what the two-party system is about, which is maintaining the status quo, this was a victory because it absolutely demonstrated the pervasive institutionalized reality of white supremacy. And this is it's just a demonstration of how much work we have to do, right? And then not only on that, it's today's President's Day, and we're honoring Abraham Lincoln, who was one of our most white supremacist and genocidal presidents in our nation's history, as well as other slave-owning presidents we've had, and owners of enslaved people who are presidents we've had throughout our nation's history, right? And it's just fatiguing, and it's tiring. And it's just days like today where we need to take a deep breath. I'm not becoming hopeless, but it's days like today, after weeks like last week, after weekends like the weekend we just had, where we have to understand and realize how much we're up against and how strong the forces are on both sides of the aisle to keep the status quo. And this is what absolutely Joe Biden promised to do. He was going to maintain the status quo. So he will have empathy and even sympathy on the people who's lost loved ones in this white nationalist terrorist attack. But he's not going to disrupt travel plans or let it ruin his Valentine's Day weekend or upset his agenda to actually hold them accountable. And unfortunately, that's the status quo. That's the status quo. Joe Biden is doing absolutely what he promised he would do, which is to maintain the status quo. And the status quo doesn't hold white landowning men, especially white landowning male presidents, accountable. It doesn't do it. The Constitution was written for that purpose. So I needed to jump online and point this out. I needed to share some of these thoughts with people. And I want to encourage people to renew our commitment to address our nation's problems at a foundational level. Renew our commitment, not to demonize our opponents, but to change the foundations and to work to build a nation where for the very first time, we the people truly means all the people. This is where we have to get the resolve. This is why we can't make this about this person or that person. This can't be about just getting Donald Trump out of office or even just changing leadership. No, this is about dealing with our foundations. This is systemic. This is foundational. And we have to be resolved to address it at a foundational level. And I want to encourage people to continue to think about it at that level, to acknowledge that we have some very hard and difficult road ahead of us. And we're not going to reach the goal of this by simply demonizing one person or trying to just change this one thing. No, we have to deal with at a foundational level. We have to get our nation to acknowledge what we're built on. In an hour and a half, actually less than an hour and a half, and at 2 o'clock, it's now 12:50. At 2 o'clock today, I'm going to give a lecture online on the unsettling truths of Abraham Lincoln's legacy. And I'm going to talk about how in 1862, Abraham Lincoln said that his primary object in this struggle was to preserve the Union, and it was not to save or destroy slavery. And I'm going to go through his entire term in office, looking at the atrocities he was willing to commit and the white supremacy he was willing to espouse in order to hold this union together. And this is one of the reasons our nation honors him. He wasn't willing to address our foundational problems. He was trying to maintain them. And this is where we have to, again, not just demonize him. That's too easy. We have to deal with the foundations. We have to see, yes, he espoused these things, he did these things, and he needs to be held accountable for those things. But again, he's not the root of the problem. The root of the problem is our foundations. And I just realized I'm going to lose my battery here in a second. So let me plug this in real quick. I apologize for that. So we need to acknowledge what's taken place, acknowledge our history. We have to build common memory. But I want to be very clear. I'm not trying to simply demonize current leaders or historical figures. That's not going to solve the problems that we're facing. I'm trying to create common memory. I am trying to address things at a foundational level. And just because I don't want to demonize these, it doesn't mean I don't want them honored either. Right? I want to acknowledge that we have foundational level problems, and we have to learn how to deal with those things and change our foundations. And I'm not trying to, So this is part of the struggle that we have moving forward. And this is how the system works, right? We saw it with slavery in the 1860s, and we're seeing it today, where our nation is not willing to hold a white landowning male accountable, even when he incites a white nationalist terrorist attack on our nation's capital. And that's a foundational level problem. And we have to learn how to address it there. So I encourage people to join me back in about an hour. I'll be back online. If you're watching on Facebook, it should turn on Facebook on my page there, Mark Charles. I'll also go on to my YouTube channel at Wireless Hogan. We'll share a link out on Twitter so you can join it from there. And then after we finish it, we'll upload it to my Instagram account and the IGTV space we have on my Instagram account at Wireless Hogan too. So I hope this has been helpful, at least to kind of process through some of these things, to think about some of these things. I appreciate all the comments. I'm not able to read them as we're going through the live stream, but I do go and read them after we're done. And I appreciate everyone who engages with me. Thank you for being a part of this journey. And I'm excited at the potential of what can happen with our nation. I'm excited that there is a growing awareness of the foundational level problems that we have. And I'm doing what I can to try and gather that energy and guide it in a productive way so that we can, again, find a way to build a nation where we the people truly means all the people. I can't help my relatives. Walk in beauty. I hope you're enjoying your second cup of coffee, and may we learn how to walk in beauty together. Hakonet.